I was 32 when I decided to take a long trip alone into the western Amazon region of Peru. It was late July 2019, and I'd saved up nearly all of my vacation time and a good chunk of money over 2 years for this. I wanted a break from my job, from the city noise, from people. I wanted something raw, something that would get me out of my head. A week deep in the rainforest, sleeping in a tent, cooking what I caught, away from every clock and screen. That's what I wanted. That's what I thought I needed. I flew into Lima, stayed a night, then took a smaller flight to a city near the edge of the jungle. From there, I arranged a boat ride that would drop me off at a remote area I had read about in a few travel blogs. People mentioned it was beautiful, less traveled, and rich in wildlife. Sounded perfect. I didn't tell anyone the exact location. My sister knew I was heading to the Amazon, and I left her my itinerary. But I didn't give the fine details. I figured I'd be fine. I had gear, a decent level of survival knowledge, and I was in good shape. The boat left me near a thin, muddy bank where the trees hung low and the bugs were already swarming around me. I waved to the boatman as he turned and disappeared down the river. That would be the last human I'd see for the next 5 days. The first night went smoothly. I hiked in about 3 miles from the river, found a flat area near a small stream, and set up my tent. The air was thick with moisture, and even though it was close to sunset, it felt like walking through a hot sponge. I boiled water, ate some rice and tuna, and zipped myself into the tent as the jungle exploded with sounds. Frogs, bugs, and birds I couldn't name. I didn't sleep well, but that was expected. Every rustle outside my tent felt like a jaguar or some giant snake. The second day, I pushed deeper. I moved slowly, hacking vines, stepping over roots that twisted like veins through the floor of the forest. My backpack was heavy with supplies: food, water purification tablets, tarp, a small stove, and a foldable fishing rod. I came across a small clearing around noon and stopped to rest. It was beautiful. Sunlight broke through the canopy in beams that looked almost solid, the way they lit up the clouds of mosquitoes and gnats. But the bugs were relentless. I had to keep moving. By the afternoon, I found what looked like an abandoned trail. It was overgrown but still showed some sign of being used at some point. Broken branches, worn soil. I followed it for a while and came across what looked like an old hunting shelter. Just some wooden planks nailed between trees with a blue tarp half shredded and flapping in the breeze. There were animal bones nearby, cleaned by insects. I couldn't tell how old the shelter was, but I got the feeling someone had been there not too long ago. I moved on. That night, I camped farther from the water. The bugs were slightly better, but something felt off. The jungle sounds were there, but I could sense a shift. It's hard to describe unless you've been alone in the woods. It's like the trees themselves are holding something back. I lay in my tent listening to the high-pitched buzzing of the forest, but every few minutes, I'd hear a break in the pattern. A snap, a pause, a sound like shifting weight on dry leaves. I told myself it was animals. Capybaras, monkeys, maybe even a tapir. But something in my gut wouldn't let it go. I kept my machete close and didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. The third day, I woke up with the feeling of being watched. I didn't hear anything. There were no footprints around the tent, no broken branches. But my body knew. I packed up quickly and moved east. I checked my map, even used my GPS unit just to be sure. I had planned to circle around and meet the river again by the 5th day. I still had food and clean water, but I wasn't enjoying any of it anymore. About halfway through the day, I found something that made my stomach drop. A shirt, faded red, tangled in a bush. It looked weathered but not rotted, not old enough to have been there long. I walked past it quickly, eyes scanning the underbrush. Less than an hour later, I found a snare trap, small, meant for rodents or maybe birds. It wasn't mine.
Primer en 7 anys traps.
I didn't want to risk drawing attention. It was a simple loop of wire, tied off to a stake hidden under leaves. And it was fresh. The metal was still shiny. I squatted by it, heart racing, and felt the dirt. The ground around it had been disturbed recently. Someone else was here. I stood up and scanned the trees. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. But again, that feeling I wasn't alone. I walked fast after that. I didn't run. I didn't want to make too much noise, but I didn't stop. Every time I looked back, I half expected to see someone behind me, standing perfectly still. By dusk, I reached a wide stretch of swamp. I couldn't see an easy way around, and I was too exhausted to try. I set up camp there, just far enough from the water to avoid bugs, close enough to fill my filter bottle in the morning. I made a fire, small, just enough to cook rice and boil water. I didn't even eat properly. I stared into the dark trees, hands trembling. That night was worse. At some point past midnight, I heard a noise I hadn't heard before. A steady, soft crunching, like footsteps on leaves. Human footsteps. I held my breath and listened. It stopped when I shifted in my sleeping bag. Dead silence, then the sound again, closer this time. I stayed inside the tent, frozen, machete in hand. After maybe 5 minutes, it stopped completely. I waited. My legs were shaking. I didn't sleep. When the sky finally turned gray, I packed everything in under 10 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't even check the trap lines I'd set up. I needed to get to the river. The 4th day was chaos. I was sweating so much I could barely see. My legs were covered in mosquito bites and scrapes. I kept hearing things behind me, rustling, breaking branches, but every time I stopped, it went dead quiet. I looked for tracks, but the floor was too messy with leaves and roots. Still, I was sure. Someone was following me. Not an animal. Person. I moved faster, sometimes nearly jogging. By noon, I came across another old camp. This one had ashes, still black, under a small pile of wet leaves. Someone had tried to hide it. There was a plastic bottle nearby, the label in Spanish, the same brand I'd seen in a store 2 days before the trip. That proved it. Someone had been out here recently. Maybe was still out here. That afternoon, I spotted something hanging from a branch about 15 feet off the ground. It was a strip of dark cloth, like a scarf or head wrap, tied tight to a branch. I don't know if it was a sign, a marker, or just lost fabric, but it didn't belong in the middle of nowhere. That evening, I skipped camp altogether. I walked until I couldn't see. I used my headlamp and pushed another hour. When I finally collapsed near a patch of giant trees, I didn't even set up the tent. I just rolled the tarp over myself and tried to disappear. That night, the footsteps came again. Louder this time. I could hear breathing. I could hear sticks snapping. Someone walked into my camp area and just stood there. I didn't move. I could hear them take slow steps around me. A full circle. Then nothing. No walking away. Just silence. I waited until morning. The second I could see the outline of trees, I was up and moving. I didn't check for tracks. I didn't look around. I just started walking. That 5th day felt like I was losing my mind. I kept thinking I was seeing shapes in the trees. Every branch looked like an arm, every shadow like a figure. My skin was raw from bites, my clothes torn, and my water was nearly out. I moved until I finally heard the sound I'd been praying for, the river. It took me another 2 hours to reach the bank, but when I did, I nearly cried. I used the GPS to mark my spot and sent out the SOS beacon I carried for emergencies. I knew it might take hours, maybe even a full day, but I stayed in that spot. When I looked behind me at the trees, I saw movement, just for a second. Someone stepped out, maybe 50 yards away, and looked at me. I couldn't see their face. They were too far. Just a dark shape. Not hiding, just standing there, watching. They didn't move. I didn't move. Then they turned and walked back into the forest. I stayed alert until the rescue boat arrived later that night. I didn't sleep, didn't eat, just sat there, eyes locked on the trees. When I got back to the city, I didn't tell anyone what happened, just that I'd gotten sick and needed to come back early. I left out everything else, but I think about it every day. Who was out there? Why didn't they approach me? Why did they walk around my camp? Why didn't they leave tracks? Was it just one person? I'll never go back. Not to the Amazon. Not to any place that wild, that deep, that far from people. Because I wasn't alone. And whoever was out there, they wanted me to know that. It was late October of 2013, and I was 32 years old when I decided to take a solo hunting trip in the hills near Larkspur Valley, Oregon. I'd been to the area a few times before, but never for an overnight trip by myself. I had done plenty of hunting over the years, mostly deer and elk, and I always found this part of the country peaceful, quiet, and undisturbed. It was the kind of land that hadn't been torn up by tourists or cabins yet. That made it feel a little more raw, a little more real. I had 2 days off work from the auto shop, and my girlfriend at the time had gone to visit her parents down in Sacramento. So it felt like the perfect chance to just get away from town, breathe some fresh mountain air, and put a little meat in the freezer if I was lucky. The weather report said there might be rain the second night, but I packed accordingly. I had a canvas tent, a decent cot, and a waterproof sleeping bag. My rifle, a well-kept Remington .308, was cleaned and sighted the day before. I had plenty of supplies, extra layers, and a thermos of black coffee already made when I pulled out of my driveway around 6 a.m. that Friday morning. The road leading up to the ridge trailhead wasn't paved, but my truck had good clearance and new tires. I drove carefully, tires crunching over wet gravel and dried leaves. It had rained a little the night before, so there was a light mist in the trees and everything smelled like pine and damp soil. I reached the clearing around 8 a.m., parked near a fallen log, and threw my pack over my shoulders. I hiked for most of the day, not in a rush, just walking slowly through the thick trees, watching for fresh signs, broken branches, tracks, maybe a bit of rubbed bark. I passed through stretches of dense pine and then up into more open terrain with dead trees that had been scorched by a fire a few years back. Around mid-afternoon, I spotted a small herd of mule deer, too far out to get a good shot. I marked the location on my GPS just in case and kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached a small hollow between two ridges that was tucked out of the wind and sheltered by trees. It was a spot I had camped near once before with an old buddy. The ground was dry enough, the view was open enough to keep an eye on the trail, and there was a natural overhang in the rocks nearby that I used as a windbreak. I dropped my pack and set up my canvas tent in the flattest spot I could find. After I had the tent up and my gear laid out inside, I collected some dry sticks and got a fire going. The sun was low by then, and a light drizzle started just as I got the fire hot enough to boil some water. I sat on a foam mat near the flame, eating a warmed-up can of stew, feeling that quiet settle over everything the way it always does when you're far away from cell towers and city noise. That night was colder than I expected. Even in layers, even in my bag, I woke up around 3 a.m. feeling stiff. The rain had picked up, and I could hear it pattering hard against the canvas. I rolled over, pulled the flap tighter, and fell back to sleep eventually, but I remember lying there for a while just listening to it. The next morning was gray and foggy, and I set out early. I figured I'd circle back toward where I saw the deer the day before. I took my time again, being quiet, being patient. I didn't spot anything right away, but I did find fresh tracks, so I knew they'd been nearby. I followed them up a ridge and down the other side, where the trees grew thicker again. By the time noon rolled around, it had started raining again, heavier this time, the kind that soaks through your sleeves and trickles down your collar no matter how you zip your jacket. I kept going for another hour, maybe two, but by then the ground was turning to mud, and it was clear the weather wasn't going to let up. I turned back toward camp, thinking maybe I'd just dry off, make some food, and ride out the storm. I reached my tent sometime around 3 p.m., and everything already looked worse. The little hollow I had camped in had started to collect water. The fire pit was soaked, and one corner of the tent had collapsed inward slightly from the weight of water. I repaired the corner with a new tie and a stake, then put on dry socks and warmed my hands with a small butane burner I always keep in case of weather like this. It got dark quickly. Heavy clouds rolled in, and the light just drained from the sky like someone was flipping a switch. I ate another can of food cold and then settled in early. I figured I'd sleep and head out early in the morning if the rain didn't let up. That night, everything changed. I woke up suddenly, probably sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. I didn't have a watch on me, but I could tell it was the middle of the night. The rain was still going steady, harder now, I could hear it slapping against the ground outside and sliding down the nylon of the rainfly. But what had woken me wasn't the sound of the storm. It was a different noise entirely. A crunch. Something stepped on a stick right outside my tent. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I lay flat on my back, every muscle in my body tense, listening. The rain masked a lot, but I heard it again. A slow, deliberate sound. Not an animal running or crashing through the brush. Just one step, then another, then silence. I slowly reached over and put my hand on the stock of my rifle, which I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't lift it, didn't move too fast, just held it and waited. I didn't hear anything else for a minute. Then I heard breathing, not my own. A low, slow breath, close, just outside the tent wall. I was trying to think of every possible explanation. Maybe an elk wandered down into the hollow, maybe it was curious. But the breathing wasn't animal. It sounded human, wet, heavy, like someone winded from walking uphill. The rain picked up even more. My tent walls shivered with the wind. I sat up slowly, quietly, and gripped the rifle tighter. I still didn't hear any more movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, standing still, watching. I waited for what felt like hours, not daring to unzip the tent flap. Eventually, the sound of the breathing faded, replaced by nothing but the wind and rain. I stayed sitting up the rest of the night, too wired to sleep again. By morning, I decided to leave. I wasn't willing to chalk it up to just paranoia or weather. Something had been out there. I packed up everything quickly, stuffing wet gear into my bag without much care. The trail back was slick, and I slipped a few times on the way down the ridge, but I didn't stop. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I just walked. About halfway back to my truck, I passed through the burned area again, the stretch of dead trees and soft ground. That's when I saw something that stopped me cold. There were boot prints, fresh ones, not mine. I checked. The pattern was wrong. Too small, too narrow. They had walked the opposite direction, toward where I had camped. I stared at them for a long time, rain dripping from my hood into my eyes. They were real, not imagined. Someone else had been out there in that weather, walking toward my camp in the middle of the night. I followed the prints for a few minutes, just to make sure I was seeing it right. They led down the trail and veered off into the brush, toward the hollow. Whoever it was, they didn't follow the normal trail. I left fast after that. I didn't stop until I reached my truck and slammed the door behind me. I was soaked, filthy, and shaking, but I didn't feel safe until I was driving back down that mountain road. I never reported it. I didn't really know what to say. There was no crime, no confrontation, just a feeling, presence. But that was enough for me. I haven't gone back to that part of Larkspur Valley since. Not even during the day. Sometimes late at night, I still think about the breathing. The way it sounded just a foot away, separated from me by nothing but a flap of wet canvas. And those boot prints, out in the rain, in the middle of nowhere, miles from any road. Whoever it was didn't come out there by accident. And I don't think they expected me to wake up. I was 26 that summer. I just moved to Tennessee a few months earlier, trying to get away from a few things back in Ohio. Some breakups, a bad job, and just too many people I didn't want to see again. I didn't know anyone in the small town I ended up in, Lorman, population maybe 4,000 on a good day. But I liked it that way. I rented a little one-bedroom house on the edge of town, worked part-time at a gas station, and spent a lot of time exploring the back roads on my days off. There was this field I found one afternoon when I took a wrong turn past the old lumber mill. It was tucked behind a set of train tracks, maybe half a mile off the gravel road, hidden by a patch of trees and a collapsed wire fence. The land sloped slightly downward, like a shallow bowl, and right in the center was an old cemetery. You wouldn't notice it driving past, not unless you were looking for it. There were maybe 20 headstones, all of them cracked, worn, and leaning in strange directions like they were trying to fall asleep. A few had names and dates, but most were too faded to read. The newest one I could make out said 1904. The place felt forgotten. peaceful even. No flowers, no decorations, no sign anyone ever visited. I liked that about it. It was quiet, a little creepy in a way that made you feel something. Not scared exactly, just aware. Like the place was still holding on to memories even if no one else remembered. That was around early June, and for some reason I kept going back. I brought a small lunch one time and sat under one of the few trees left standing. Another time I brought my camera and took some pictures of the headstones. I started thinking about camping there, just for a night. I'd done plenty of solo camping before, mostly in state parks or friends' land, but something about spending a night in that graveyard field stuck in my head. I don't know why exactly. I wasn't trying to be edgy or chase some spooky thrill. I just liked how far it felt from everything. So one Friday in late July, I packed my gear. I kept it simple, just a one-man tent, a sleeping bag, flashlight, knife, water, protein bars, lighter, and a small propane burner. No firewood, no beer, nothing stupid. I parked my truck a little up the road and hiked in. It was still hot, humid, and full of mosquitoes, but the sun was starting to dip behind the trees when I got there. The shadows stretched long over the field, making the headstones look taller than they were. I set up the tent just outside the fence line, not right in the cemetery, but close enough to see the stones from where I'd be sleeping. I laid out my gear, ate a quick dinner, and sat there for a while, just listening. There were no cars, no dogs barking, no people, just crickets, some birds, and the occasional train in the distance. The grass was knee-high in places, dry and prickly. I had to stomp out a spot to lay my stuff down. As it got darker, I noticed how easily the place blended into the trees around it. The line between the field and the woods was barely there. Everything turned to shadow fast, and by 9 p.m., I needed the flashlight to see more than a few feet ahead. I wasn't scared, not then. I'd camped in stranger places, abandoned farms, riverbeds, once even a scrapyard outside Detroit. I knew how to read a place, and this one felt calm. I zipped myself into the tent around 10, with my knife close to the sleeping bag and the flashlight beside my head. I fell asleep to the sound of cicadas. I woke up sometime around 1 in the morning. Not to a noise exactly, more like the absence of noise. The cicadas were gone. No birds, no breeze. It was just still. My eyes opened slowly. I thought maybe it was a dream, but then I noticed how sharp the silence felt. Heavy. My heart picked up a little, nothing crazy, just that automatic tension your body gets when something feels off. I stayed still and listened. I couldn't hear anything outside the tent, not even the usual rustle of the grass in the wind. I unzipped the tent flap a couple inches and looked out. The moon was high enough to cast light across the field, but it didn't reach the edges where the trees were. Everything past the cemetery was just black. The headstones were there, same as before, but they looked different. Not moved or anything, just different. Maybe it was the light. Maybe it was my eyes adjusting, but they looked taller, sharper, more like jagged rocks than weathered slabs. I didn't hear anything, but I felt something. The way the air presses against you when someone's standing too close. That kind of presence. I shut the flap and laid back down, but I didn't sleep. I held the flashlight and stared at the tent ceiling for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke again to the sound of footsteps. Not animals, not wind, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the grass. They circled once. I didn't move. I just held my breath and listened. They stopped near the tent, paused, and walked away again. I never heard them run, never heard any voices. Just that slow crunch of footsteps on dry grass, and then nothing. I stayed in the tent until the sky turned gray. When the light was strong enough to see clearly, I finally unzipped the flap and looked out. The field was empty. The headstones were exactly where they'd been the day before. No tracks, no signs of anyone. But about 30 feet from my tent, near the far corner of the cemetery fence, there was something I hadn't seen before. A small pile of stones. Newer, cleaner, stacked neatly, maybe 10 inches high. I got up and walked over to it. They weren't part of any headstone, just loose rocks placed carefully in a triangle, like a marker or a warning. There were also tire tracks near the tree line, faded but visible. Not mine. These were wider, spaced further apart, maybe from a pickup or some kind of utility vehicle. They weren't there yesterday. I would have seen them. I know I would have. Something about that combination, the stones and the tracks, made my stomach twist. I didn't want to stay any longer. I packed fast. Everything went into the bag in under 5 minutes. I kept looking back at the woods, scanning for movement. There was none, but the silence was still there. That same heavy stillness from the night before. I got back to the truck and drove straight home. Didn't stop. Didn't eat. I locked my doors and left the gear in the bed until the next day. Over the next few weeks, I tried to forget about it. Told myself it was probably just some hunter or farmer passing through. Maybe kids messing around. But something about it didn't sit right. The silence, the footsteps, the stone pile kept coming back. So one day in late August, I went to the town hall and asked about the cemetery. Didn't say I'd camp there, just said I'd come across it on a hike and was curious. The lady at the desk didn't know much, but she gave me a name. Harold Dobbins, an old guy who'd lived in Lorman his whole life. He used to be the caretaker for some of the old properties around the area. I called him and he agreed to meet for coffee. He told me the cemetery used to be part of a small settlement that vanished in the early 1900s. Disease, poverty, something like that. No one really knew. The land changed hands a few times but never got developed. He said a lot of the old records were gone, burned in a fire. But one thing he remembered clearly, there used to be a shack near the cemetery just beyond the tree line. Some local family used it for storage or hunting gear, he wasn't sure. One day it burned down. No one ever claimed it. And after that, people stopped going near the place. Too quiet, he said. Doesn't feel right. That was the last time I brought it up to anyone. I never went back to that field. I thought about it more than once, but every time I got close to the road leading there, I turned around. Something happened that night. I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't some ghost story. It was real, flesh and blood. Someone who knew the land better than I did. Someone who didn't want me there. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about those footsteps. The way they circled, the way they paused, like they were thinking, not curious, not cautious, just deciding. And for whatever reason, they decided to walk away. I never forgot how lucky that felt. It was the last weekend of August 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip out in northern Montana, about an hour from Libby, deep into the Kootenai National Forest. I was 32 years old back then, single, and had gotten too used to the noise of the city. I'd been working construction since I was 20, and by that point, the long days and sore knees didn't bother me much. What did bother me was the way everything felt like it was closing in. Traffic, deadlines, honking horns, loud bars, people everywhere. I just needed quiet, a place where I could hear myself think. No phone signal, no streetlights, no buildings, just trees, dirt, and maybe the sound of a creek running somewhere nearby. I packed up my old green Tacoma with a tent, sleeping bag, my grandfather's old hunting rifle, which I mostly brought for black bears, a cooler with some simple food, 2 gallons of water, my camping stove, flashlight, folding chair, and a new pair of hiking boots I'd only worn once. I'd scoped out a place on a paper map a few days before. No marked trails led there, just a clearing in the trees, close to a slope and near a small lake. I thought about bringing my fishing gear but left it at home. I wasn't going to fish. I wasn't going to hike. I wasn't going to do anything, really. I just wanted to sit in the woods and remember what silence sounded like. I left early Friday morning and drove most of the day, passing through the last bits of paved road, then dirt, then nothing but forest all around. The last hour of the drive was slow, trees brushing against both sides of the truck, bouncing around on rocky paths, careful not to blow a tire or bottom out the suspension. Finally, I parked beside a wide dead tree that had fallen years ago and rotted where it lay. I got out, stretched my back, and just stood there for a minute. The only thing I could hear was the wind brushing through the leaves above me. That alone made the drive worth it. I grabbed my gear and hiked about 15 minutes west, through brush and uneven ground, until I found the spot. A circular clearing maybe 50 feet across, soft dirt and moss underfoot, with a decent view of the slope running down toward the lake maybe a quarter-mile away. It was perfect. I could see the water through the trees, but I was far enough away that I wouldn't have to worry about mosquitoes or animals coming to drink in the middle of the night. I set up the tent just inside the tree line to keep some shade. No fire pit, no rocks stacked up, no old garbage. No signs anyone had camped here before. Exactly what I wanted. By the time I had the tent staked down and my gear inside, the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. I heated a can of chili on the stove, ate it sitting on the back of the truck bed, then packed everything up and stashed the cooler in a bare bag strung between two trees. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The air was cold but not freezing, and it was dead silent. No cars, no neighbors, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. The next morning, I got up around 6 and walked down toward the lake with my thermos of instant coffee. The slope was steeper than it looked from the tent, and I had to dig my boots in deep to keep from slipping. At the bottom, the ground flattened out into a narrow stretch of soft, wet moss and muddy patches. A few animal tracks cut through, deer, raccoon, nothing big. I stood at the edge of the lake for a while, just sipping my coffee and watching mist float above the water. I didn't see another soul. Not a boat, not a plane overhead, not even a trail marker. I was just about to head back up when I noticed something odd. A piece of white fabric tangled around the base of a bush, maybe 30 yards to the left, near the edge of the tree line. It looked like part of a t-shirt. I walked over and crouched down, brushing it free. It was torn. The edge looked like it had been ripped, not cut. The fabric was dirty, weathered, but not old. No mold or heavy staining. My first thought was maybe a hunter lost something, or maybe a hiker cut themselves on a branch and wrapped the wound. But there was no blood, just a ragged edge and some dirt. I tucked it in my back pocket, not really sure why, and walked back to camp. Stuck in my head a little. The whole point of this place was how far it was from anything. I hadn't seen a single vehicle or even fresh tire marks on the way in. The odds of someone being out there and dropping a shirt were slim. I shrugged it off. Probably nothing. Probably something from last season. That afternoon, I read a book, cleaned my gear, and took a short nap in the tent. Around 3, I decided to take a longer walk up the slope behind the clearing to see if I could get a better view of the lake and maybe spot some deer or elk. The slope leveled off into a ridgeline maybe 30 minutes up, and I could see everything from there. The lake stretched out like a mirror, dark green trees packed in tight around it, my tent barely visible through a break in the canopy. I sat on a flat rock and took a drink from my bottle, watching the sky shift into orange as the sun dropped lower. That's when I saw the first boot print. It was about 10 feet to my left, just beside a narrow game trail. The print was sharp, fresh, edges still solid. My boots didn't match. Too small for mine. Maybe size 10, 10 and a half. The tread wasn't anything special, just a standard outdoor hiking pattern. But it hadn't rained in over a week, and this ground was dry, which meant whoever made it had walked through here very recently. I looked around. No broken branches, no sound. Just that single print. I followed the game trail for a bit, maybe 30 yards, but didn't find any more prints. It got steeper and rougher the farther I went, and after a while I turned around. On the way back, I kept scanning the dirt. I checked around my tent. Nothing. The forest was quiet. That night, I didn't sleep quite as well. I left my rifle just inside the tent flap. Not loaded, but close by. I told myself it was probably a hiker, someone passing through. Maybe they knew about the lake. Maybe they were camping nearby. But I hadn't seen or heard a single person since I got there. The next morning, I felt better.
Drank my toffee.
Ate some jerky. Decided to hike around the lake and circle back. I brought the rifle with me that time, strapped across my back. I told myself it was for bears. The trail around the lake was thick with brush, uneven and narrow. I was about halfway around when I saw the first piece of gear. A red nylon strap like the kind used on a backpack hanging from a tree branch. Torn clean through. No pack in sight. About 20 feet farther, I found the pack itself. It was black, shoved under a bush, half covered in dirt. The zippers had been cut open, not unzipped. The contents were mostly gone. A crushed granola bar wrapper, an empty plastic water bottle, and a small first aid kit with the top half missing. No ID, no maps, no clothing. Just trash. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. My chest felt tight. My mouth was dry. Something was off. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a bag someone didn't want to be found. I turned around and walked back to camp. No more exploring. No more wandering off trails. I packed up everything in my tent and threw it back into the truck. I had every intention of leaving right then and there, but when I got to the driver's side, something made me freeze. There were boot prints in the dirt, not mine, coming from the slope, stopping right at my truck door. They weren't there when I left. I slowly backed away, heart pounding, rifle in my hands now. I circled the truck. More prints on the passenger side. A faint smear on the window like a palm. Someone had walked right up to the truck while I was gone. Watched me maybe, or searched it. I started the truck and backed out as fast as the trail would let me, tires grinding over rocks and twigs. I didn't stop, didn't even breathe right until I was 20 miles out and hit the pavement again. But I didn't go home. Not yet. I drove to the Forest Service office in Libby and told them what I'd seen. The torn shirt, the boot prints, the backpack with the slashed straps. They took me seriously, brought out a map, and marked the location I gave them. One ranger said there'd been reports a couple years back of a man living rough out in those woods. Not homeless exactly, just avoiding people. Had run-ins with hikers. Angry, paranoid type. But they never found him. I gave them the scrap of fabric I'd found. They thanked me, promised to send someone out. I never went back. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the ranger station. They told me they'd found the remains of a campsite about half a mile from where I'd set up. A tarp strung between trees, animal bones, a knife stuck into a tree trunk, and another backpack. This one had an ID in it. The guy it belonged to had been reported missing in 2014. Never found until then. They wouldn't say if they found anything else. Just that I'd been smart to leave. I don't camp anymore. Not alone. Not out that far. The silence I once craved now makes my skin crawl. Because sometimes, silence means someone is watching you. Waiting. Close enough to see you, but not close enough to hear. And if I'd taken a different trail that morning, if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I would have. It was the summer of 2019 when I finally took time off work and drove up to southern Colorado to meet my cousin Marcus. He had just returned from a 2-year deployment overseas and was stationed temporarily at Fort Carson. I hadn't seen him in over 3 years. We grew up more like brothers than cousins, and before he joined the Army, we used to hike and camp out every other weekend. Getting back to the wilderness with him was something I looked forward to. Marcus had always been the brave one, disciplined, sharp, and calm under pressure. The Army had only intensified that part of him. I was 30, working a desk job in Phoenix, and hadn't been camping in 2 years. He was 32 and had just returned from what he described vaguely as a rough stretch of desert work. We didn't talk much about the details of his deployment. We decided on a spot deep in the San Isabel National Forest. It was about a 5-hour drive from where he was stationed. The area wasn't super popular with tourists, which was part of the reason Marcus picked it. He knew I didn't like crowded campgrounds, and neither did he. We wanted to be off-grid for a couple days, far from roads and people. We packed light but efficiently. Marcus was meticulous about gear. 2 small tents, high-calorie MREs, fire starter tools, water filters, a basic medical kit, and a satellite phone just in case. He carried his old combat knife, and I had a regular folding one in my pack. We each carried a small flashlight and an emergency whistle, though we didn't think we'd need either. We drove up early Friday morning. The road was dirt for the last 2 hours and climbed slowly into the forest. By early afternoon, we were unloading the truck and locking it behind a thick grove of spruce trees. From there, we hiked about 4 miles into the woods, following an old hunter's path Marcus had marked on a satellite map. He said it hadn't been used regularly for at least a decade, based on the overgrowth and lack of trail markers. By 6 p.m., we reached a flat clearing tucked between two shallow ridges. A small creek ran about 100 yards south of the spot, and the tree cover was thick but open enough to let some moonlight in at night. Marcus nodded approvingly. He said the elevation was good for visibility, and the ridges would block wind from most directions. We set up camp, lit a small fire, and boiled water to hydrate the MREs. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast. We sat around the fire and caught up. Marcus was quieter than he used to be, but I didn't press him. After a while, he leaned back on a log and closed his eyes. I stared at the flames until they were just glowing embers, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep. That first night was quiet. No wind, no animals, just the soft hiss of the creek in the distance. I woke up once in the middle of the night to pee and looked up at the stars. I hadn't seen a sky that clear in years. The next morning, Marcus was already up, boiling water. He had walked a little further up the ridge at first light and said he spotted some fresh deer tracks and what looked like a collapsed hunting blind. We ate breakfast, packed a small bag, and decided to explore that area. We left the tents and supplies at camp since we'd be back before sunset. We climbed the eastern ridge, cutting through dense brush and over fallen logs. It was tougher going than I expected. The incline wasn't steep, but the footing was uneven, and I slipped twice. Marcus helped me up both times without saying anything. Eventually, we reached a plateau with a great view of the valley below. That's where we saw it. Off to the right, maybe a quarter mile through the trees, was a small structure. It looked like an old shed or maybe a hunting cabin. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls leaned inward. We hadn't seen anything like that on the satellite maps. Marcus frowned and pulled out his phone to mark the location. He said we should check it out. Took us 20 minutes to get there. Up close, the structure looked even worse. The door was barely hanging on, and most of the inside had been overtaken by dead leaves, moss, and mold. We stepped in carefully, watching our footing. Inside, there were 2 rotted wooden cots, a collapsed table, and some rusted cans. It smelled like wet earth and mildew. Marcus checked one corner and picked up a faded plastic container. It held a few rounds of old ammunition. .308s, he said. Likely for a deer rifle. He handed it to me, and I noticed the label on the side. For Jack, keep dry. The handwriting was shaky. We looked at each other for a moment. Then he shrugged and said we should head back. The way back was slower. The sun was already behind the trees by the time we got to camp. Marcus built the fire, and I refilled our water bottles from the creek, filtering the water like he showed me. We didn't talk much. I think we were both still thinking about that cabin. That night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, more like a soft crackling or snapping. I sat up and listened. It was coming from the woods to the north. A few seconds later, it stopped. I leaned forward and unzipped the tent slowly. Marcus was already standing outside, holding his flashlight low. He made a hand gesture for me to stay put. I didn't. I got out quietly and followed him. We walked about 20 feet from camp before stopping. Something had moved through there recently. The ground was disturbed, and there were broken branches, but no clear tracks. We circled the area for a few minutes, then returned to camp. Neither of us said anything. We just added more wood to the fire and sat there for a long time. The next day, we stayed near camp. Marcus sharpened his knife and cleaned gear while I went down to the creek to fish a bit. I wasn't good at it, but it gave me something to do. Around noon, Marcus called me over. He had found something behind the northern ridge. It was a rope, a thick one, stretched tightly between 2 trees. It was about chest-high, old but still strong. Attached to it were rusted metal hooks, evenly spaced, like for hanging game or drying clothes. The bark on the trees had deep grooves where the rope had rubbed in the wind. It had been there a long time. We cut the rope down and brought it back to camp. Marcus said it looked like someone had used it for dressing deer, but the hooks were too close together and too small for that. He kept staring at one of the hooks. It was bent slightly, like it had been pulled hard. The metal was reddish-brown, like it had seen a lot of weather and maybe something else. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, closer. Twigs snapping, soft crunching of leaves. I unzipped my tent and saw Marcus crouched near the fire. He had his knife out. I grabbed mine and moved toward him. He pointed toward the ridge. I squinted but didn't see anything. Then I heard a low thump, like something heavy had hit the ground. Then silence. We waited. After 10 minutes, Marcus motioned to me. We circled the camp with flashlights, scanning the trees. We didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of movement. But when we got back, something was different. The fire pit had been disturbed. Some of the rocks were out of place, and a stick Marcus had used to stir the coals was gone. He looked around slowly, then said we should stay up until daylight. I didn't argue. The next morning, we packed everything quickly. Marcus didn't explain, but I knew he felt something was off. We hiked back toward the truck in silence. About halfway there, we saw fresh tracks. Not boots, not animal, bare feet, not large but not small either. They followed the trail for a few yards, then veered off into the brush. We didn't follow. When we reached the truck, Marcus did a full check before unlocking it. Everything was intact. We drove back to the nearest ranger station and reported the rope, the old cabin, and the fire pit disturbance. The ranger didn't say much, just nodded and said they'd send someone to check it out. We never found out who or what was near our camp those nights. Maybe someone else had been living off-grid up there. Maybe someone saw us and decided to scare us off. Whoever it was, they knew those woods better than we did. They knew how to move without being seen, how to get close without being heard. They didn't take anything. They didn't hurt us, but they were close. After that trip, Marcus didn't talk much about going back. I didn't either. He got transferred 6 months later to a base in Alaska. I went back to my job in Phoenix. I still go camping sometimes, but never that deep in, and never without checking everything twice. I learned that not everything in the woods is wild. Some things watch, wait, and walk among the trees, not ghosts or monsters, just people. People who don't want to be found. People who know how to vanish. We were lucky. We left with everything we came with. But sometimes, when I'm up late and the house is quiet, I still hear that sound in my head, that soft crunch of leaves in the dark, and I wonder how close they really got. It was late summer in 2018, and I had just turned 33 a few weeks earlier. I was living in Denver at the time, working a stressful desk job in insurance claims. I didn't hate the job, but I needed a break from the city. I'd been burned out, anxious, and feeling that kind of pressure that doesn't really go away even when you're off the clock. I needed fresh air, quiet, and no people, so I planned a solo camping trip into the San Isabel National Forest. I had been to a few popular campgrounds out there before, but this time I wanted something more remote. I dug around some old maps, read a few trip reports on forums, and eventually decided on a spot way off the usual trails, roughly 10 miles from any of the maintained roads. There was no name for the spot, just an old Forest Service access trail that hadn't been used in years, according to the maps. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, food in sealed containers, GPS, map, compass, water filter, and 2 canisters of propane for my small stove. I brought my .38 just in case, always kept it unloaded in the pack unless something felt off. I didn't expect to need it. I wasn't worried about wildlife or people. The only reason I even carried the gun was for peace of mind. I left the city on a Thursday morning. The drive was beautiful, endless stretches of pine forest and jagged cliffs lining the highway. I stopped for gas in a small town near Salida and then took a winding dirt road into the mountains. I parked my truck off the side of a faded trailhead and loaded up my pack. There were no other vehicles around, which is what I wanted. The hike took a few hours. It wasn't particularly steep, but the terrain was rough. Overgrown brush, downed trees, and loose rocks slowed me down. I followed the old Forest Service trail for a while, then veered off according to my map, heading toward a small clearing I had marked as my campsite. It wasn't on any official list. It looked like a patch of relatively flat ground nestled in a small valley near a stream. When I finally reached it in the early afternoon, I was exhausted, drenched in sweat, and already nursing a sore ankle from stepping awkwardly on a root. But the clearing was perfect. Tall pines shielded the area, and I could hear the gentle flow of water nearby. I set up my tent, laid out my gear, filtered water from the stream, and cooked a small meal. As the sun went down, the air cooled quickly. I wrapped myself in a jacket, sat on a flat rock, and listened to the forest settle. That first night was calm. No strange noises, no wind, no animals sniffing around. Just silence and the occasional chirp of crickets. I slept well. The next morning, I decided to explore the area a little further. I left my gear at the camp and hiked about a mile east, following the stream. The land started sloping downward, and I found a narrow ravine with a cluster of boulders and dead trees piled near the bottom. It looked like the aftermath of a small landslide, but it wasn't recent. Moss had already started growing over the rocks. On my way back, I noticed something odd just a few hundred feet from my camp. There was a faint path cutting through the underbrush, almost invisible unless you were standing right on it. It wasn't natural, too straight, too clean. I followed it for a bit. It led to a strange clearing, maybe 20 feet wide, perfectly circular. At the center was a small mound of rocks. It didn't look like anything ceremonial or ancient, just a pile. But something about it didn't sit right. I got the weird feeling I was being watched, though I was completely alone. I headed back to camp quickly. I didn't want to dwell on it. I told myself it was probably just an old fire pit or a forgotten marker from some backwoods surveyor. Still, I didn't sleep quite as soundly that night. The third day, I spent most of the morning fishing in the stream. Caught a couple of small brook trout, nothing big, but it felt good to be doing something simple. In the afternoon, I wandered around the nearby ridge to get a better view of the valley. That's when I saw it. Through a small break in the trees, maybe half a mile from my camp, I spotted movement. At first, I thought it was a deer or an elk, but it was a person. Definitely a man, dressed in dark clothes, hunched over and walking slowly. He was carrying something heavy, cradled in his arms like a bundle. I froze and watched from behind a fallen log. He didn't look like a hiker. No backpack, no visible gear. Just this limp bundle in his arms and a slow, deliberate gait. I waited until he moved out of sight, then quietly made my way back to camp. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just another camper, and the bundle was firewood or equipment. Still, the way he moved and the way he was dressed, it didn't feel right. And there was no reason for anyone to be out here. This wasn't a known trail. I hadn't seen any signs of other people. No tents, no fires, nothing. That night, I barely slept. I kept my unloaded .38 beside me and lay in my sleeping bag with one ear open, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard something move near the camp. It was quiet, cautious, stepping on soft pine needles. I didn't move. I just listened. I circled once, maybe twice. Then nothing. No retreating footsteps. Just silence. The next morning, I found a single boot print near the edge of my camp. It wasn't mine. I made up my mind to leave. I packed quickly, skipping breakfast, stuffing everything into my pack without much care. I was tired, paranoid, and just wanted to get out. The hike back was slow. My ankle was worse now, swollen and sore. Every few hundred feet, I'd stop and scan the woods, convinced someone was watching. It wasn't until I reached the old Forest Service road that I let myself breathe. My truck was still there, untouched. I tossed my pack into the back seat and got behind the wheel. Just as I was about to pull away, I noticed something hanging from my passenger side mirror. It was a small strip of cloth, tied in a tight knot, faded gray, almost like the material the man had been wearing. I hadn't seen it when I left. Someone had been near my vehicle. I drove back to Denver without stopping. Didn't even grab food until I got home. I spent the next 2 days in my apartment, blinds closed, phone off, trying to shake the paranoia. Eventually, it passed. I went back to work, back to the same routine. But a few weeks later, something happened that made me realize it wasn't all in my head. A news story came out about a missing hiker near Salida, a woman in her late 20s. Last seen heading out alone into the mountains. Her car was found parked along a remote service road, same area where I had camped. The article mentioned search efforts, but no sign of her was found. The photo they used showed her smiling, dark hair, red jacket. I don't know for sure if that was what I saw, but I think about the man, the bundle in his arms, the boot print near my tent, the cloth on my mirror. I never went back into those woods again, and I started locking my windows at night. I was 31 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip through eastern Oregon. Not the lush, green side you usually see in pictures. This was the high desert, dry pine forests, big stretches of brown grass and sagebrush, and endless gravel roads that go nowhere. It was July of 2019, and I had just come off a long job in Portland working construction. I needed a break. I figured a few days in the mountains, away from everyone, would clear my head. No phones, no people, just me, a cooler full of beer and food, and my old Ford Ranger packed with gear. I drove out from Pendleton around mid-morning, took the 395 south until I hit this little forest road that led into the Umatilla National Forest. It was a weekday, Tuesday I think, so I didn't expect to see anyone out there. Once I left the highway, I didn't. The gravel road twisted up into the woods, kicking dust behind me as I climbed higher into the dry pine-covered ridges. About 2 hours in, I found this open spot beside a shallow creek. Nobody around for miles. The trees thinned out just enough for some sun to break through, and there was even a flat area to pitch the tent. Perfect. I set up camp quick, tent, camp chair, small fire ring with some rocks, and cracked a beer as the sun slid behind the tree line. The first night was calm. A few deer moved around in the brush after dark, and I heard an owl now and then. The air was warm, dry, but not hot, and I fell asleep to the sound of the creek trickling beside me. I woke up once around 3 a.m. to pee and just stood there for a bit, listening. So quiet, just the wind in the pine needles and the occasional creak of the tent nylon shifting. I felt good out there, comfortable. The next morning, I hiked up one of the ridges behind camp. The view was incredible, just miles of trees, hills, and clear blue sky. No signs of people. I spent most of the day walking, following game trails, occasionally checking my GPS just to make sure I wasn't getting too turned around. Around 4 p.m., I got back to camp and jumped in the creek to wash off the sweat. I laid out in the sun for a while after, drank another beer, and started up a small fire to cook some food. It wasn't until that second night that I started to feel something was off. I was sitting by the fire around 9:30, just watching the flames and letting the heat hit my face when I heard this sound. Crunching, like footsteps, coming from up the slope behind my tent. I froze. It wasn't an animal. I know the sound of deer moving through brush. This was slow, steady, and heavy. Someone was walking out there. I killed the fire fast, just stomped it out and grabbed my flashlight. But I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position, not until I knew what was going on. I crouched beside a fallen log and listened. The footsteps stopped. Nothing moved. I stayed like that for almost 20 minutes, barely breathing, waiting to hear them again. But it was silent. Finally, I moved back to the tent, got inside, and zipped it up. I kept my knife close and didn't sleep much. By morning, I almost convinced myself it was a deer or maybe even my own mind playing tricks. You start to hear weird stuff when you're alone in the woods. Still, I felt uneasy. I packed up a few things and drove back down the road a bit, found another spot a few miles away, deeper into the forest. This site was tucked between two ridges, shaded and tighter than the last. There was a decent clearing and some flat ground, but not much of a view. I figured that might help me feel less exposed. I set up quick and made a point to clear a wide area around the tent, checking for tracks or anything strange. There was nothing, no tire marks, no boot prints, just my own. The day passed slow. I tried to read, but couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the tree line, thinking about those footsteps. I stayed close to camp. When it got dark, I skipped the fire and just sat inside the tent with my headlamp, ate a cold dinner. It felt safer in the dark not to advertise where I was. I dozed off sometime after midnight. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't up the hill. They were right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. Whoever it was, whatever it was no more than 5 feet away. I could hear the gravel and pine needles crunching under boots. They moved slowly, circling the tent once. I was too scared to unzip the door or grab my flashlight. They stopped directly behind me at the back of the tent. No sound. I laid there frozen, waiting for them to unzip it or stab through the fabric or something. But after a minute or two, the steps moved off again, slowly fading into the trees. I waited until dawn to get out. When I did, I found tracks. Not big ones, average-sized boots. They came from the direction of the ridge and looped around the tent exactly once before heading off into the brush. I followed them a short ways. They didn't go far. After about 50 feet, they just stopped, like the person had turned and walked backwards in their own prints. I stood there for a long time, heart racing. My hands were shaking. I went back to camp, stuffed everything into the truck, and drove out fast. Didn't even bother with the gravel road this time. I just followed the creek bed until I hit the main forest road again. I made it to a small ranger station about 30 miles out and told the guy at the desk what happened. He looked tired and didn't seem too interested. "Probably another camper," he said. "Sometimes people get curious. Nothing to worry about." I didn't argue. I just nodded and left. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, how they stopped so suddenly, how they circled the tent so slowly. That wasn't curiosity. That was someone watching. Someone who wanted me to know they were there. I got a cheap motel that night and planned to head home the next morning. I figured the trip was over. Lesson learned. But around 10 p.m., as I was lying on the motel bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something was wrong. I had packed everything in a rush that morning, my gear, food, everything. But I hadn't packed the cooler. I had left it outside the tent, with my name and address written on the underside. My heart dropped. I jumped out of bed, tore through the truck, hoping maybe I had thrown it in and just forgotten. But it wasn't there. That cooler was still out there in the woods, and someone had my name. I drove back out at first light. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I thought I'd get there early and grab it before anything happened. But when I pulled into the old site, everything was gone. Not just the cooler. The fire ring stones were scattered. My footprint marks were all smudged, like someone had kicked dirt over them. And sitting on a log where my tent had been was a folded paper napkin. I picked it up. On it, in blue ink, someone had written, "Don't come back." That was it. I stared at that napkin for a long time. The handwriting was clean, slanted, not messy or rushed. Whoever wrote it had taken their time. I burned it on the spot, threw dirt over the whole campsite, and got back in the truck. I drove 14 hours straight to get home. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the windows, making sure the doors were locked. I bought a camera system, motion lights, a new deadbolt. Nothing ever happened. Nobody ever showed up. But I still don't know who was out there, or why they picked me. Sometimes I wonder if they were watching from the beginning. Maybe even saw me pull off the highway. Maybe I just camped too close to something I wasn't supposed to find. A hidden grow-op, an old cabin, something buried. Or maybe they were just someone who lived out there off the grid and didn't want company. But the way they moved, the way they circled the tent, that was planned. It's been 6 years. I've gone camping since, but only with other people. Never alone. Never in Oregon. And I never leave anything behind. Not even a cooler.